The tears fell from Rosalie Peterson's eyes like raindrops on the dusty wooden floor of her small homestead cabin. Mixing with the broken pieces of her mother's china plate, the last memento she had of a woman 3 years in the grave. Her hands trembled as she tried to gather the shattered fragments, a sob catching in her throat as a particularly sharp edge sliced her finger. The year was 1876, and life in Wyoming territory had never felt so desperately lonely. "Miss, you all right in there?" The deep voice startled her, causing Rosalie to drop the pieces she'd collected. She hadn't heard anyone approach, which wasn't surprising given how the howling wind had picked up outside. Scrambling to her feet, she hastily wiped her tears with the back of her hand, leaving a small smudge of blood on her cheek from her cut finger. "I'm fine," she called out, her voice betraying her. "Who's there?" The door creaked open slowly, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the fading light of dusk. A cowboy stood there, hat in hand, respectfully waiting at the threshold. His clothes were travel-worn but clean, and his eyes were kind beneath the shadow of trail dust on his brow. "Thomas Blackwood, madam, I was passing by and heard." He paused, his gaze falling to the broken china on the floor, then back to her tear-stained face. "Thought someone might be in trouble." Rosalie quickly wiped her face again, embarrassed to be caught in such a state. "It's nothing. Just a broken plate." She knelt back down, attempting to gather the pieces, but her hands were shaking too badly. The cowboy stepped inside, closing the door against the wind. Without invitation, he knelt beside her, carefully picking up the fragments of porcelain. His hands were large but moved with surprising gentleness, gathering the delicate pieces. "This looks like it meant something to you," he said softly. Rosalie nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "It was my mother's from back east, the only thing I had left of her." Thomas examined one of the larger pieces, running his thumb over the blue floral pattern. Then, with a conviction that surprised her, he looked directly into her eyes. "I'll build a table that never breaks," he said firmly. "One that'll keep your treasures safe from now on." Rosalie stared at him, confused by both his presence and his offer. "I don't understand. You're just passing through, aren't you?" Thomas Blackwood nodded slowly, a small smile crossing his weathered face. "I was, but I reckon some journeys take unexpected turns." He stood up, towering in the small cabin, and placed the broken pieces carefully on her simple wooden table, the same rickety table that had collapsed under her mother's china when she'd been cleaning it. "You need a proper table, and I happen to be good with my hands." That was how it began. With broken china and a promise from a stranger. Neither Rosalie nor Thomas could have known then how that moment would change everything, how a shattered plate would lead to mended hearts in the wild frontier of Wyoming. Rosalie studied the stranger cautiously. Men passing through these parts often had dubious intentions, and a woman alone had to be careful. But there was something in Thomas Blackwood's steady gaze that didn't set off her well-honed instincts for danger. "Mr. Blackwood, while I appreciate your offer, I can't accept help from a stranger. Especially not one who might be gone with tomorrow's sunrise." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Fair enough, Miss Peterson, Rosalie Peterson, Miss Peterson." He tipped his head slightly. "I understand your caution. How about this? I'm looking for work before the winter sets in. I can help around your place for a fair wage, and part of that work will be building you a proper table. No charity, just honest work and pay." Rosalie considered his offer. Her husband James had been dead for over a year now, taken by a fever that swept through the territory. Since then, maintaining the small homestead had been a constant struggle. The upcoming winter already filled her with dread. There was wood to be chopped, the roof needed patching, and the barn door hung precariously on one hinge. "I can't pay much," she admitted. "Room and board plus a small wage would be fair," Thomas replied. "I've been on the trail for months. A roof and regular meals would be welcome." After a moment's hesitation, Rosalie nodded. 2 weeks, Mr. Blackwood. We'll see how it goes." The relief on his face was genuine. "Thank you, Miss Peterson. You won't regret it." That night, Thomas slept in the barn despite Rosalie's concerns about its condition. "I've slept in worse," he assured her with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. The next morning, Rosalie woke to the sound of hammering. Stepping outside in the crisp dawn air, she found Thomas already at work on the barn door, having fashioned new hinges from pieces of metal he'd found in the tool shed. "Good morning," he called, tipping his hat. "Hope I didn't wake you too early." "I'm usually up with the sun," she replied, surprised by his initiative. "There's coffee on the stove when you're ready." Over breakfast, a simple affair of cornbread and bacon, Thomas outlined his plans for repairs around the homestead. "The roof needs attention before the snow comes." "And that table?" He glanced at the wobbly table between them. "I noticed some good oak not far from here would make a sturdy piece." Rosalie found herself studying him as he spoke. Thomas Blackwood was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his mid-30s. Lines etched around his eyes suggested years under the sun, and a thin scar ran along his jawline. His hands, though calloused and strong, moved with precision as he sketched a design for the table on a scrap of paper. "Where are you from, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, curious about the man who had appeared so suddenly at her door. Thomas looked up from his drawing. "Originally Tennessee, left after the war, been moving west ever since." The war. She knew immediately he meant the Civil War that had torn the nation apart more than a decade earlier. He nodded, his expression closing slightly. "Fought for the Union. Didn't much feel like going home after." Rosalie understood. Many men who'd survived the bloodshed had drifted westward, seeking new beginnings or perhaps running from memories. Her own husband had been one of them, though he rarely spoke of his experiences. "And you, Miss Peterson, you're not originally from Wyoming territory, I take it?" "No," she said, pouring more coffee. "Boston. My husband James brought us out here 5 years ago, dreaming of our own land." "He died last year." Thomas nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry for your loss, thank you." She quickly changed the subject, not wanting to dwell on painful memories. "About that table, you don't need to make anything fancy, just something sturdy will do." "A good table is the heart of a home," Thomas said, resuming his sketching. "It should be both beautiful and strong, like the woman who sits at it." The compliment, delivered so matter-of-factly, caught Rosalie off guard. She felt a warmth in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the coffee or the morning sun streaming through the window. That day set the pattern for those that followed. Thomas worked from sunrise to sunset, moving methodically through the repairs the homestead desperately needed. The barn door was fixed by noon of the first day. By the end of the week, he had patched the roof, repaired the chicken coop, and reinforced the fencing around Rosalie's small vegetable garden. Through it all, Rosalie found herself watching his methodical approach to problems. The way he spoke gently to her 2 horses when he thought no one was listening. The quiet humming of unfamiliar tunes as he worked. There was a piece about Thomas Blackwood that seemed at odds with his weathered appearance and the hint of sadness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Thomas often whittling small pieces of wood while Rosalie mended clothes or read from one of her precious books. The silence between them was comfortable, unlike the lonely quiet that had haunted the cabin before his arrival. On the 10th day, Thomas disappeared into the woods with an axe over his shoulder. He returned hours later dragging a sizable oak log behind his horse. "Found the perfect wood for your table," he announced, pride evident in his voice. "Needs to season properly, of course, but I can work with it." Rosalie watched as he began the process of shaping the wood, first splitting the log and then carefully removing the bark. His hands, so large and powerful, worked with the precision of an artist as he began to transform the raw material. "Where did you learn to work wood like this?" she asked one evening as he sanded a table leg to silky smoothness. Thomas paused, a faraway look in his eyes. "My father was a furniture maker back in Tennessee. I worked alongside him from the time I could hold a tool." A small smile played at his lips. He used to say that working with wood was like having a conversation with a living thing. You had to listen to what it wanted to be. He sounds like a wise man. He was. Thomas ran his hand over the grain of the wood. He didn't live to see the end of the war. Our workshop was destroyed in a battle near our town. Rosalie reached out impulsively, placing her hand on his arm. I'm sorry. Thomas covered her hand with his own briefly, the touch sending an unexpected warmth through her. It was a long time ago. But I still hear his voice sometimes when I'm working. The 2 weeks Rosalie had initially agreed to came and went, with neither of them mentioning Thomas's departure. The first snow fell, light and tentative, one morning in early November. Rosalie stood at the window, watching the flakes drift down, when she realized with sudden clarity that she didn't want Thomas to leave. The thought of returning to her solitary existence made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. That evening, as Thomas put the finishing touches on the table, a beautiful piece with sturdy legs and a smooth, polished surface, Rosalie gathered her courage. Winter's setting in, she said casually, stirring the stew that bubbled on the stove. The path to town often gets blocked with snow. Thomas looked up from his work. I've been thinking about that. I should probably move on before the weather turns too harsh. Rosalie's heart sank, though she kept her expression neutral. Of course, you've more than earned your wage. I can pay you tomorrow. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his hands still on the wood. Unless, Rosalie turned to face him, trying not to appear too eager. Unless you might need help through the winter. These homesteads can be hard to manage alone when the snow piles up. Relief flooded through her. I was thinking the same. If you're willing to stay on, there's plenty of work still. The wage would remain the same, though I can't offer more. Thomas stood, brushing sawdust from his clothes. The wage is fair, and I find I'm not quite ready to move on just yet. Their eyes met across the room, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that there might be reasons beyond practical considerations for his staying. The next day, Thomas carried the finished table into the cabin with a proud smile. It was more beautiful than Rosalie had imagined. The oak gleamed with a warm honey color. The legs were carved with simple but elegant patterns, and the surface was smooth as glass. It's stunning, she breathed, running her hand over the wood. It'll never break, Thomas promised. Not with normal use anyway, might survive a buffalo stampede. Rosalie laughed, the sound bright in the small cabin. I don't plan to test that claim, Mr. Blackwood. Thomas, he said softly. I think after all this time you might call me Thomas. Thomas, she repeated, liking the feel of his name on her lips. And I'm Rosalie. That evening they shared their first meal at the new table. Rosalie had made a special dinner to celebrate venison stew, biscuits, and even a small apple pie from the last of her preserved fruit. As they ate by lamplight, the new table between them seemed to represent something more than just a piece of furniture. It was a new beginning. Later, as Thomas prepared to head to the barn where he still insisted on sleeping despite the increasingly cold nights, Rosalie handed him the carefully wrapped pieces of her mother's broken plate. I want you to have these, she said. Thomas looked surprised. But they're your memories of your mother. Rosalie shook her head. I was thinking, perhaps they could become something new. You're so skilled with your hands. Could they be inlaid somehow? In another project, understanding dawned in his eyes. You're thinking of keeping them but giving them new life. Yes, she said simply. Thomas carefully tucked the wrapped pieces into his pocket. I have just the idea. Trust me, I do, Rosalie replied, realizing as she said it how true those words had become. As winter settled fully over the Wyoming territory, the small homestead became a world unto itself. Snow piled high around the cabin, and days were marked by the routine of survival, chopping wood, tending the animals, preserving what food they had. Yet within that routine, Rosalie found a contentment she hadn't known since before James's death. Thomas proved to be not just a skilled craftsman but a thoughtful companion. In the long evenings, he told her stories of his travels across the country. described cities she'd never seen, and listened attentively when she spoke of her life in Boston and the dreams that had brought her west. Slowly, carefully, like the way he worked with wood, Thomas began to reveal more of himself. He spoke of fighting at Gettysburg, of the friends he'd lost, and the struggle to find purpose in the aftermath. He told her about wandering from job to job, ranch hand, trail cook, carpenter, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. "Why did you stop here?" Rosalie asked one night as they sat by the fire, snow falling heavily outside. "There are bigger ranches that could use your skills, towns where you could set up as a furniture maker." Thomas was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he looked up from the small piece of wood he was carving. "I wasn't planning to stop," he admitted. "I was headed to California, thought I might try my luck there." He set down his carving knife. "But then I heard crying through your door, and when I saw you there with that broken plate, something told me this was where I needed to be." The simple honesty of his words touched Rosalie deeply. "I'm glad you stayed," she said softly. "So am I." His eyes held hers, and for a moment Rosalie thought he might say more, might cross the invisible line they had drawn between themselves. Instead, he returned to his carving, though his expression remained thoughtful. December brought a week of bitter cold that froze the water in the well and made every trip to the barn an ordeal. On the third night of the cold snap, Rosalie woke to the sound of Thomas coughing violently in the barn. Without hesitation, she pulled on her coat over her nightgown and lit a lantern. Battling through the snow, she made her way to the barn, finding Thomas huddled in his makeshift bed, shivering despite the blankets piled on him. "This is ridiculous," she declared, helping him to his feet. "You're coming to the house." Too weak to argue, Thomas leaned on her as they struggled back through the snow. Inside the cabin, Rosalie built up the fire and made a pallet for him near the hearth. "I don't want to impose," he protested weakly as she pressed a cup of hot tea with honey into his hands. "Nonsense." "You're no use to me with pneumonia," she replied briskly, though her hands were gentle as she placed another blanket over him. "Drink that and rest." For 3 days, Thomas's fever raged. Rosalie barely slept, applying cold compresses to his forehead and coaxing broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. In his delirium, he sometimes called out names she didn't recognize or relived moments from battles long past. On the 4th night, as she dozed in a chair beside him, Thomas's hand found hers. "Rosalie," he whispered, his voice hoarse but his eyes clear, "you're still here." "Of course I'm here," she said, squeezing his hand. "Where else would I be?" A weak smile crossed his face. "I dreamed you were gone, that all of this was just something I'd imagined." "I'm real," she assured him, brushing damp hair from his forehead, "and you're going to be fine now. Your fever's broken." Thomas's recovery was slow but steady. Even after he was well enough to return to the barn, Rosalie insisted he remain in the cabin. "It's practical," she argued when he protested. "Why should you freeze out there when there's room enough in here?" They established new boundaries. Thomas slept near the fire while Rosalie kept to her small bedroom, but the dynamics between them had shifted. There was a new awareness, an unspoken acknowledgement of feelings growing beyond friendship or convenience. Christmas approached, bringing with it a temporary break in the weather. Taking advantage of the milder days, Thomas disappeared into his workshop in the barn for hours at a time, refusing to let Rosalie see what he was working on. "It's a surprise," was all he would say, his eyes twinkling with a boyish excitement that made him look years younger. Rosalie, too, had her secrets. In the moments when Thomas was occupied elsewhere, she worked on a gift for him, a new shirt sewn from fabric she'd been saving, embroidered with subtle patterns along the collar and cuffs. It was the finest thing she'd made in years, and as her needle moved through the cloth, she found herself imagining how he would look wearing it, how the deep blue would bring out the color of his eyes. On Christmas Eve, they shared a special dinner at the table Thomas had built. Rosalie had used some of her precious stores to prepare roast rabbit, potatoes, and even a small cake sweetened with the last of her sugar. A single candle lit their meal, casting a warm glow over the table. "I have something for you," Thomas said when they had finished eating. He disappeared outside briefly, returning with a small wooden box, beautifully crafted with intricate carvings around the edges. "Merry Christmas, Rosalie." She took the box with trembling hands, admiring the craftsmanship before carefully opening the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, was a heart-shaped locket. But it wasn't ordinary metal. Thomas had somehow worked the pieces of her mother's broken plate into a mosaic, the blue and white porcelain forming a delicate pattern that caught the candlelight. "Thomas," she whispered, tears filling her eyes, "how did you?" "Carefully," he said with a smile, "very carefully." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "I wanted you to have a way to keep your mother's memory close but made new, not broken anymore." Rosalie lifted the locket from the box, discovering that it hung from a slender leather cord. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "Here," Thomas said, rising from his chair and coming to stand behind her. "Let me help you put it on." His fingers brushed the nape of her neck as he fastened the cord, and Rosalie felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the winter cold. When he had finished, his hands lingered on her shoulders, a touch so gentle it might have been imagined. "I have something for you too," she said, her voice hardly more than a whisper. She retrieved the package containing the shirt and handed it to him shyly. Thomas unwrapped it with care, his expression softening as he held up the garment. "You made this, for me?" Rosalie nodded. "I noticed your shirts were getting rather worn." Thomas ran his fingers over the embroidery. "No one's made me anything like this since my mother died. Thank you." He looked at her with such warmth that Rosalie felt her heart might burst. "Try it on," she urged, suddenly eager to see if it fit properly. Without hesitation, Thomas removed his old shirt. In the candlelight, Rosalie caught glimpses of scars across his chest and shoulders, remnants of his time at war or perhaps from the hard years that followed. He slipped the new shirt over his head, and Rosalie felt a surge of pride seeing how well it suited him. "Perfect," she said, reaching out to straighten the collar. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the months of careful distance melted away. Thomas's hand covered hers where it rested against his chest. "Rosalie," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something." "Yes," she whispered, hardly daring to breathe. "I didn't stay just because you needed help with the homestead. I stayed because from that first day when I saw you crying over that broken plate, I felt something I haven't felt in years, maybe ever." He took a deep breath. "I'm falling in love with you, and if that's not something you want to hear, I'll understand. I can leave when the weather breaks." Rosalie silenced him by rising on her tiptoes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but when Thomas's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, it deepened into something more urgent, more honest than any words could have been. When they finally broke apart, Rosalie rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beating of his heart. "I don't want you to leave," she said. "Not tomorrow, not when spring comes, not ever." Thomas lifted her chin with his finger, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" "I don't have much to offer. You have everything to offer," she interrupted. "You rebuilt more than just a table, Thomas. You rebuilt this home. You brought life back into it, into me." That night, for the first time since her husband's death, Rosalie didn't sleep alone. Thomas held her through the night, their bodies fitting together as if they had always been meant to find each other. As snow fell softly outside, covering the world in silent white, they whispered promises and shared dreams that had lain dormant for too long. With the new year came new beginnings. Thomas formally proposed on New Year's Day, offering not a ring but a small wooden carving of two hands clasped together, a symbol, he explained, of the partnership he hoped they would build. "It doesn't have to be right away," he assured her. "I know it might seem sudden." But Rosalie, who had known too well how fragile life could be, didn't want to wait. "Life is too short for hesitation," she told him. I've already lost one chance at happiness. I won't lose another. They were married in late January by a traveling preacher who stopped at their homestead on his circuit through the scattered settlements. The ceremony was simple, just the two of them and the preacher in their small cabin, with the beautiful table Thomas had built serving as an altar of sorts. Rosalie wore her best dress with the porcelain locket around her neck. Thomas wore the blue shirt she had made him, freshly washed and pressed for the occasion. Their vows were straightforward but heartfelt, promises to stand by each other through whatever life might bring. That night, as husband and wife, they lay together planning their future. Thomas spoke of expanding the homestead, perhaps building a proper workshop where he could create furniture to sell in the nearby town once the passes cleared. "We could use the money to buy more cattle in the spring," Rosalie suggested, her head resting on his chest. "Start building a real ranch. We'll make something good here," Thomas promised, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Something that will last." As winter slowly gave way to spring, their plans began to take shape. Thomas built an extension onto the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and expanding the main living area. Together, they planted an enlarged vegetable garden, and with the money Thomas earned selling some of his smaller woodworks in town, they purchased 3 cows and a bull, the beginnings of a modest herd. Word of Thomas's craftsmanship spread through the territory. Settlers from miles around began commissioning pieces, tables, chairs, cabinets, even cradles for expected babies. What had begun as a single promise to a crying woman had blossomed into a thriving business. Rosalie, too, found new purpose. She started a small side business selling preserved fruits and vegetables from their garden, her Boston education allowing her to keep meticulous records of their growing enterprise. Together, they made a formidable team, his practical skills complementing her head for figures and organization. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch of their expanded home watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and purple, Rosalie placed Thomas's hand on her stomach. "We're going to need one of those cradles you've been making for others," she said softly. The wonder that spread across Thomas's face was something Rosalie knew she would remember until her dying day. He gathered her in his arms, his joy too great for words, and they sat together as twilight deepened, dreaming of the expanded family that would soon gather around the table he had built. Their daughter, Elizabeth Marie Blackwood, was born the following spring, a robust baby with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin. Thomas crafted not only a cradle but a special box to hold the remaining fragments of Rosalie's mother's plate, a keepsake to be passed down to their daughter when she was old enough to understand its significance. As Elizabeth grew, so did the Blackwood homestead. Thomas's reputation as a master craftsman continued to spread, and by the time their daughter was walking, they had built a proper workshop beside the house and expanded their cattle herd to a respectable size. 2 years after Elizabeth's birth, a son joined their family, Thomas James Blackwood, named for his father and Rosalie's first husband, an acknowledgement of the past that had led them to each other. Life wasn't always easy. The Wyoming territory could be harsh and unforgiving. There were difficult winters, dry summers that threatened their crops, and the constant challenges of frontier life. But through it all, the table Thomas had built remained at the center of their home, a gathering place where the family shared meals, where decisions were made, where joys were celebrated and sorrows comforted. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Rosalie would catch Thomas running his hand over the table's surface, a look of satisfaction on his face. "Best promise I ever made," he would say when he noticed her watching, "building a table that never breaks." And Rosalie would touch the porcelain locket that rarely left her neck, remembering the broken woman she had been and marveling at how completely she had been made whole again. 10 years after Thomas Blackwood first appeared at her door, the Blackwood Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the county. Their home, expanded several times, now stood as a testament to their shared vision. The workshop had grown into a small factory employing 3 local men, producing furniture that was shipped as far as Denver and Salt Lake City. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Thomas led Rosalie outside to show her his latest project, a gazebo overlooking the valley, built from the same oak as their table, with a bench wide enough for their family to sit together on summer evenings. "For the next 10 years," he said, drawing her close, "and the 10 after that. And after that," Rosalie teased, though her eyes were bright with tears of happiness. "After that, we'll need a bigger bench for all the grandchildren I expect we'll have by then." Rosalie laughed, the sound carrying across the land they had nurtured together, land that had once seemed lonely and impossible to manage alone. "I like the sound of that future." As they walked back to the house hand in hand, they could see Elizabeth and Thomas Jr. playing near the corral, their laughter mingling with the sounds of cattle and horses that populated their thriving ranch. Inside, waiting for them, stood the table that had started it all, strong, beautiful, and unbroken, just like the love that had built a life around it. Later that evening, as the children slept and Thomas and Rosalie sat together by the fire, he presented her with a small wooden box similar to the one he had given her that first Christmas. Inside was a miniature replica of their table, perfectly crafted down to the grain of the wood, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. "What's this for?" Rosalie asked, turning the tiny masterpiece in her fingers. Thomas smiled, the firelight catching the silver that had begun to thread through his dark hair. "A reminder that the strongest things aren't always the biggest. Sometimes it's the small promises we keep that build the most lasting foundations." Rosalie leaned against his shoulder, thinking of the broken plate that had brought them together, of the tears that had turned to joy, of a journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness. "I never would have imagined, that day you found me crying, that we would build all this together," she said. "I knew," Thomas replied with quiet certainty. "Not the details, maybe, but I knew when I saw you that I'd found what I'd been looking for all those years on the trail." "And what was that?" Rosalie asked, though after a decade together she knew his heart almost as well as her own. Thomas took her hand, his thumb brushing over the simple gold band he had placed there years before. "Home," he said simply. "I found home." As the fire crackled and night settled over the Wyoming valley they had made their own, Rosalie thought about the meaning of that word home. Not just the buildings they had raised or the land they had claimed, but the life they had created together, sturdy and beautiful, like the table that had started it all. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the promise of tomorrow, of years yet to come, of a love that, like Thomas's craftsmanship, had been built to last, strong enough to weather any storm, beautiful enough to treasure, and unbreakable in all the ways that truly mattered. The Blackwood ranch continued to flourish as the years passed. By the time Elizabeth turned 16, the territory had become the state of Wyoming, bringing new settlers, expanded railway connections, and growing markets for their cattle and Thomas's furniture. Elizabeth, with her mother's intelligence and her father's artistic eye, had developed a talent for design, often sketching new furniture pieces that Thomas would bring to life in his workshop. Thomas Jr., now 14, showed a natural affinity for ranching, spending every moment he could with the growing herd, learning the business from experienced hands they'd hired as the operation expanded. On Elizabeth's 18th birthday, Rosalie presented her with the porcelain locket Thomas had crafted so many years before. "This contains pieces of your grandmother's plate," Rosalie explained as they sat together at the table that had become the heart of their home. "I was crying over its broken pieces the day your father found me." Elizabeth ran her fingers over the smooth porcelain fragments arranged in their delicate pattern. "And he offered to build a table that never breaks," she said, familiar with the story she'd heard throughout her childhood. "He did more than offer," Rosalie said softly. "He built it, and then he built everything else." She looked around their comfortable home at the life they had created. Sometimes the breaking of one thing leads to the creation of something far more beautiful. That same year brought changes to the family. Elizabeth, much to her parents' mixture of pride and concern, announced her intention to attend college in Denver, a bold move for a young woman in 1894, but one that neither Thomas nor Rosalie would discourage, having both valued education in their own ways. "Your mother and I didn't raise you to think small," Thomas told his daughter as he crafted a special traveling trunk for her books and belongings. "We built all this from almost nothing. You go and build your own dreams now." As Elizabeth prepared to leave for Denver, a young man named Robert Miller began calling at the ranch with increasing frequency. The son of the local banker, Robert had grown up alongside the Blackwood children, but had recently returned from schooling in the East with new appreciation for the spirited young woman Elizabeth had become. "He's sweet on her," Thomas observed to Rosalie one evening as they watched Robert and Elizabeth walking along the creek that bordered their property. "She could do worse," Rosalie replied pragmatically. "He's educated, respectful, and his father's bank holds most of the mortgages in the county." "But she's going to Denver first. Romance can wait," Thomas chuckled, drawing his wife close. "Spoken like a woman who knows her own mind. She gets that from you, you know, and her stubbornness. That's all you, Thomas Blackwood." Their laughter mingled in the evening air, the comfortable banter of a couple who had weathered 20 years together, their love deepened by shared struggles and joys. With Elizabeth away at school, Thomas Jr. took on more responsibility at the ranch. Now 16, he had his father's height and strength, along with a quiet confidence that made the ranch hands respect him despite his youth. "He'll take over the ranching side one day," Thomas predicted as they watched their son expertly breaking a spirited colt in the corral. "And do a better job of it than I ever could." "And your furniture business?" Rosalie asked. "Who will inherit your skills with wood?" Thomas was thoughtful. "Perhaps neither of them. Elizabeth has the eye for it, but her interests lie elsewhere." Thomas Jr. appreciates fine craftsmanship but doesn't have the patience for the detail work. He smiled at his wife. "Maybe a grandchild will show the interest." "Eager for grandchildren already," Rosalie teased. "Elizabeth isn't even 20. Not eager, just planning ahead." Thomas wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "That's what you taught me to do, remember? Always look to the future." The future arrived sooner than either of them expected. Elizabeth returned from her first year of college with her degree incomplete and a diamond ring on her finger. Robert Miller had followed her to Denver, wooed her persistently, and proposed before the spring semester ended. "I know it seems sudden," Elizabeth told her parents, her eyes bright with certainty that reminded Rosalie of herself at that age. "But why wait when you're sure?" Thomas and Rosalie exchanged a glance, remembering their own quick courtship born of recognition that some connections were too precious to question. "If you're sure, then we're happy for you," Rosalie said, embracing her daughter. Thomas was more practical. "And your education, the plans you had?" "Robert supports my continuing my studies," Elizabeth assured him. "And his father has offered him a position in the bank that would allow us to stay nearby. I could even help with the bookkeeping for the furniture business." The wedding was held that autumn on the Blackwood Ranch, with the ceremony taking place in the gazebo Thomas had built. Guests from throughout the county attended, a testament to the respect the family had earned over the years. As Thomas walked his daughter down the aisle, Rosalie was struck by how far they had come from that day of broken china and tears. Their home was filled with love and prosperity, their children grown into fine young adults, their legacy secure in the land they had nurtured and the business they had built. During the reception, held in the large barn Thomas had expanded and decorated for the occasion, he found Rosalie watching the dancing with a contented smile. "Happy?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she admitted. "Though I'll miss having her in the house." "They'll be just in town," Thomas reminded her, "and you know she'll be over constantly to tell us how to run the ranch and the business." Rosalie laughed. "She is rather opinionated, like someone else I know." Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple, his touch still sending warmth through her after all their years together. "Dance with me." As they moved across the floor, other couples stepping aside in deference, Rosalie felt a surge of gratitude for the life they had built together. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked. "When you found me crying over that broken plate?" Thomas's eyes crinkled at the corners, the lines deeper now but his gaze still as warm as it had been that first day. "Only every time I see you smile, only every time I sit at our table. Only every day of my life." The following spring brought the news that Elizabeth was expecting. Rosalie threw herself into preparations for her first grandchild with characteristic energy, while Thomas retreated to his workshop for weeks, emerging only for meals and sleep. "What are you working on that's so secret?" Rosalie finally demanded after he declined her company in the workshop for the third time that week. Thomas smiled mysteriously. "You'll see. It's a surprise for the little one." When Elizabeth went into labor on a warm June evening in 1896, the entire family gathered at her home in town. After hours of anxious waiting, Robert emerged from the bedroom with a tiny bundle in his arms. "A girl," he announced proudly. "We're calling her Rose after her grandmother." Rosalie's eyes filled with tears as Robert placed the infant in her arms. The baby was perfect, with a dusting of dark hair and eyes that, when they briefly flickered open, showed hints of the Blackwood blue. Thomas stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes suspiciously bright as he gazed down at his granddaughter. "She's beautiful," he whispered, "like her namesake." When mother and baby were strong enough, Thomas finally revealed his secret project, a rocking cradle unlike any Rosalie had ever seen. Crafted from the finest maple, it featured intricate carvings of wildflowers around the edges and, inlaid in the headboard, a delicate pattern made from the last remaining fragments of Rosalie's mother's plate. "You saved some pieces all these years?" Rosalie asked, touching the smooth porcelain inlay with wonder. "I knew there would be a perfect use for them someday," Thomas replied. "A way to connect 4 generations of strong women. As baby Rose grew, so did the family's enterprises." Thomas Jr. took a wife of his own, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, bringing new lands and connections to the Blackwood holdings. The furniture business expanded with a proper showroom in town, managed primarily by Elizabeth, who balanced her work with motherhood in a way that made Rosalie immensely proud. Thomas, now in his 60s, began to step back from the daily operations of both the ranch and the furniture business, though he still spent hours in his workshop, creating special pieces that were more art than functional furniture. His reputation had spread beyond Wyoming, with commissions coming from as far as Chicago and San Francisco. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the home they had expanded and improved over 30 years together, Rosalie found Thomas looking thoughtful as he gazed out over their land. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her hand finding his as it had countless times over their years together. "About legacies," he replied. "About what we leave behind." Rosalie followed his gaze to where their grandchildren, now 4 of them between Elizabeth and Thomas Jr., played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "I'd say we've built a pretty good one," she observed. Thomas nodded slowly. "It started with a broken plate and a promise. Strange how life works out, isn't it?" "Not so strange," Rosalie countered. "You saw something broken and instead of walking away, you stayed to fix it. That's who you are, Thomas. That's who you've always been." He turned to her, his expression softening. "And you let me stay. That's who you are, brave enough to trust again, to build again, even after loss." As twilight deepened around them, Rosalie rested her head on her husband's shoulder, thinking of all the moments that had led them here, from that first day of tears and broken china to this peaceful evening surrounded by the fruits of their shared life. Inside their home, the table Thomas had built still stood in its place of honor, its surface marked now with the small nicks and scratches of decades of family-use children's homework, holiday feasts, business ledgers, crayon drawings from grandchildren. Yet it remained as sturdy as the day he had completed it, a testament to his craftsmanship and the promise he had made. "You know," Rosalie said after a comfortable silence, "that table really never did break." Thomas smiled, pressing a kiss to her silver-streaked hair. "Some promises are easier to keep than others." "And the others?" she asked, "the ones about loving you for all my days." His voice was soft with emotion. "Those turned out to be the easiest of all." As darkness fell over the Wyoming valley they had called home for more than 3 decades, Rosalie and Thomas Blackwood sat together, surrounded by the legacy they had built from a broken plate, and a sturdy table, a legacy of love, family, and promises kept against all odds. And in the gentle Wyoming twilight, as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they knew with the certainty that comes from a lifetime shared that some things, once mended with love and care, truly never break again.